Next speaker is Derek Dreyer. Derek is a professor at NPI. He's also the general chair of this year's CFP. And he's going to talk about how to give talks that people can follow.
Yes. 1 second. All right. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So, yes, thank you, Dave. My name is Derek Dreyer. I've been a faculty member for almost 12 years at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Saarbrücken, in Germany. And I'm also general chair of ICFP this year. So, if you have any feedback, any complaints, any suggestions, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I will do my best to listen. So this morning you heard a great talk from Amal on managing your research and managing your PhD. So if you take your advice, and let's say you get into a good program, you find a good advisor who fits your interests, you've learned how to manage them well so that they get you on a good project from the beginning, and things are going along well. You get maybe in your first year or two you get a submission. You write a paper and you submit it to ICFP, and it gets accepted. You've made it. Well, not so fast, okay? Because now you actually have to give a talk at a conference at ICFP, okay? And this is terrifying. So this is terrifying not just for junior researchers. This is terrifying for everybody, okay? Every time I have to give a talk, not only for a big audience, but even for smaller audiences, I always have to go to the bathroom 3 times before the talk. I start, getting very hot and sweating, and all these terrible things happen. And I've been giving talks for a long time. Okay, so that's very normal. And why is it so normal? Well, that's a big audience, right? It's a lot of people. ICFP this year has something like 450 participants in the main event. Right? That's just a lot of people staring directly at you. On the other hand, it's an opportunity, a unique opportunity, because there's a lot of people staring directly at you. Okay, that's a huge opportunity to advertise your research before a large group of your peers, and to communicate directly to them as effectively as you can in a short amount of time. So it's really worth trying to figure out how to give a good talk, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So why is this so tricky? Okay, I think the main reason, which is what I'm going to try to tell you about how to sort of offset this problem. The main reason that's tricky is because the audience doesn't typically look like this. Okay, they typically look a little more like this. Right. First of all, usually ICFP is not in such a grand, sort of palazzo. Although once I did give a talk at Venice, which was in a very nice theater like that. But usually the main problem is, people have a lot of contention for their attention. Okay, they have many other things they're interested in. They have lots of backlog of emails, especially by the last day of the conference. They suddenly realize their inbox is filled up, and also they may or may not be interested in your talk. Right? There's a lot of different talks at the conference. ICFP, even a conference like ICFP, which is focused on a particular topic like functional programming, still has a broad variety of different research topics, and you can't assume that most people in the audience are necessarily interested in your specific research problem. Of course, it can even be worse. If you're lucky enough to be scheduled in the session right after lunch, like this one, then the audience can sometimes look a bit more like this. Okay, so you have to somehow counteract this. So one piece of advice that I've heard people give, which is in principle good advice, is you have to entertain your audience. Okay, so Simon Peyton-Jones, by the way, if you haven't seen this talk, this is online. I think John Hughes' talk is also excellent. Talk is also online. On giving research talks, and one of their big pieces of advice is you have to really wake up the audience. You have to sort of be energetic. Your most potent weapon is your enthusiasm. Put on a show, and in principle that's true. That obviously if you can do that, that's great. The problem is that I don't really know how to teach that. Okay, it's good advice, but it's not really clear how to make it actionable, because people tend to be either entertaining or not entertaining. And many people in computer science in general are pretty nerdy, to be honest, and it just doesn't come naturally to go stand up before an audience and be super entertaining. So instead, today I'm going to try to give you somewhat more actionable, more constructive advice that you can use when you go give a talk. So the way I'm going to structure this talk is basically around a central question, which is what distinguishes a conference talk from a paper? Okay? What is uniquely challenging about giving a conference talk that is not as much of a problem when you're writing a paper? And so first I'll start off by giving the plus. Okay, so the plus is what I've said already. Basically, you have this unique opportunity to communicate to a large audience at one time. Okay, that's a big plus. But as far as I'm concerned, that's the main plus. Okay, there aren't too many other advantages to giving a talk in terms of communicating ideas. So, can anyone suggest what some negatives might be, or what some challenges might be? Yeah.
Yeah, usually I have very little time.
You have little time. Very good. Yeah. Yeah.
Cross-reference well.
You can't cross-reference well. So what is the effect of that? Sure, but what happens if you don't? You lose people. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You have a wide variety of understandings in the audience.
You have a wide variety of understandings. That's right, and also a wide variety of backgrounds. And yeah, was there another one? Yeah.
People usually don't bring the background to your things that are interest you, so you have to give a high-level sketch instead of about
Yes, that certainly is true. Yes, but yes, that's sort of falling into this general problem of yes, the audience has a wide set of backgrounds. So basically, that's the main ones I listed. So here, so first of all, yeah, you can't say much. It's really short. The audience. So I wrote this as the audience may or may not care. The more general thing is, yeah, the audience has a wide variety of backgrounds, and whether they are particularly interested or know very much about your particular topic, you certainly can't assume that. And then people will get lost. Okay, even people who are really interested in understanding your talk will easily get lost. Now, this does vary among different people. Some people are very good at following talks. Some people, like me, are terrible at following talks. So maybe that's one reason I spend so much time thinking about how to give a good talk, because I find it very hard to follow many people's talks. So you have to worry about all three of these things a lot when you're preparing a talk in a way that you don't have to worry as much about when you write a paper. You have to worry about, certainly the first one you don't generally have to worry about when writing a paper. These two, you still have to worry about to some extent, but not nearly as much. So, so we're going to look at all three of these points, okay? The projector is very light here. Okay, that's supposed to be highlighting that. So you can't say much, okay. So what can you do about not saying much, or what is the effect of that? Well, so so I'm going to start with, this is a structure of papers that I often use when I'm writing papers. So in my papers, there's typically an abstract. Well, you have to have an abstract. There's an intro. Well, you have to have an intro. There's a section on key ideas, which I'll come back to in a minute. But this is basically about sort of elucidating the key ideas of your work, the key ideas behind your technical contribution in a way that people can understand at a higher level. Then there's the technical meat, which is like the main sort of technical body of the talk. This typically takes up the biggest part, and then some related work. That's how I structure my papers, generally speaking. So which of these sections do you think still remain in a talk? Key ideas, intro. Nope. So well, so let me be a little more precise there. So generally, you should have some comparison with related work to the extent that is necessary in order to get across the intro and the key ideas. Okay, but not necessarily anymore, or yeah, not any more than that if you don't have the time. Okay, and we'll get into a bit more when that related work gets mentioned in a second. Okay. So that intro and the key ideas, and now let me. I'm gonna be talking about the details of how you structure the intro in just a few minutes. I just want to say briefly about this whole idea of key ideas. So the point of key ideas, and this is something I often don't see in talks, and that's why I'm making a big point of emphasizing it. Key ideas is, you can think of it as like if you were talking to someone and trying to explain your research to them in like 5 to 10 minutes. How would you do it, right? You typically would not sort of pull out your paper, go to the technical section, start walking through inference rules or whatever, and explaining all the details of your general solution. You would go to the whiteboard, or that board over there, or whatever, and start drawing like the basic motivating example and working through like how to, roughly speaking, how does your approach work? Okay, think that's the level at which you want to present the key ideas section. Okay, it's really like trying to explain to someone the basic idea of your paper at the whiteboard. And it's based very much on using concrete examples. Okay, you should always think about how can I make this more concrete for the audience by giving concrete examples that illustrate a common case, not necessarily the general case. Okay, because people, of course, if they want to know the general solution, that's what the paper's for. Okay, so those are the only two sections that remain, and just to give you a rough idea of how I would structure time. There. This is for like a 20-minute talk. Okay, ICFP this year is more like 17-minute talks. So for a 20-minute talk, I typically have something like 8 minutes for the intro and 11 minutes for the key ideas, which is the rest. Now you may say, okay, that only adds up to 19. So the last minute is what else is in the paper. So obviously, if you're just explaining the key ideas and you're not talking about the more general technical results, then it's useful, I find, to have one slide at the end of the talk where I just briefly summarize what, if you thought this was interesting, here's all the other cool stuff that's in the paper. Okay? And that's where I usually conclude. Some people also have future work, other things like that. That's also fine. But this is typically how I do it. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So now let's get into, obviously there's a lot that goes on in the intro and the key idea, so let's get into more details here. So the audience may or may not care, right? So what do you, when the issue is, right, again, the audience has all these things contending for their attention. What is the first thing that you think the audience wants to know when you start speaking?
Why should I listen to you?
Why should I listen to you? Yes. And more specifically, so what might answer that question? Yeah.
Does this affect their work?
Well, that's so. Yeah, obviously, many people may be wondering that, but of course, people will still listen to talks that are not on their work directly, but they still, yeah. No, you usually don't have to say who you. I mean, that's not usually. People generally don't necessarily know most of the speakers, especially if there are lots of there's many student speakers they haven't seen before. They don't necessarily care about that. Yeah. What the applications are, that's certainly one. Yeah. Anything else?
I can take away from.
What you can take away, yeah, but I'm thinking more specifically. What's the main, yeah.
What's the topic of the talk?
Yeah. Yeah, basically that's what I'm getting to. What's your problem? Okay, so like, what is the problem that you are studying, right? It's a very simple question. They want to know what the problem is. And I tell you, I've seen many talks where people just start launching into something, they often start getting into some example, and examples are good, but often they just start talking about something, and I'm not sure what this talk is about for quite a while. So I think that the first thing you have to do is just get the audience aware of what your problem is. Some of them may, by the way, after they understand what your problem is, they may say, oh, I really don't care about that. I'll open my laptop. That's fine. Those people are not going to listen to your talk anyway. Okay, but there's a lot of people in the middle who may or may not be interested, but they at least need to know something like, where is this talk going? Right? That's the main thing people often don't know in a talk. Where is this going? So I think you have to really get to a problem as soon as possible. And the main reason this is challenging is because often it takes a while to explain your problem. If you try explaining your problem to someone at lunch, it's hard to explain it in less than, in my experience, it's hard to explain it in less than like 5 minutes. Even that is short. Okay, so you have to somehow, and that however is too long for a general audience member, right? If someone has to wait 5 minutes to have any idea where the talk is going, they're going to tune out. So what I tend to do is I like to get to a problem in 2 minutes. Okay, people will typically give you 2 minutes because 2 minutes is pretty short. And I try to explain a general version of the problem that we're solving. Like, what is this? What is the overarching problem? And make it still concrete. Okay, so it can't be like, there's lots of bugs. I mean, I've seen talks where people are like, oh yeah, there's lots of bugs. Concurrency is hard. I don't know, whatever. That's too vague, right? I mean, that's a boring problem. It has to be somewhat interesting. It has to be something tangible, but it has to be some kind of problem that you get to, which is sort of the general problem you're working on. And then once you've said that, then people have some idea. Okay, I generally know the topic of this. Well, maybe I'll listen a little longer, and you get them to continue. And then I work for like the next 4 minutes or so to sort of drill down to the actual problem. And here, the goal is to get to a point where you can, you're both motivated and you can explicitly state the specific problem you're working on, okay? And the specific problem is, what does the specific problem mean? It means the problem that you are addressing that prior work has not adequately addressed, okay? And that should be clearly stated. Again, I've seen many talks where, people sort of generally work around to something that seems like a problem, but it's never stated like, this is the thing we are solving that no one else has solved. Now here's the mention of related work. So this is the time in the talk where I typically would mention some related work as needed in order to explain why previous work didn't solve this specific problem. Okay, and it's fine to mention some prior work here. You don't have to go into a lot of details about it. It suffices to sort of state the limitations of prior work without fully justifying everything and fully explaining everything. People will trust you more or less that you're being honest about that, and they can read the paper for more details. Okay. All right, so then, so once you've gotten to this point of stating the problem, then what do people want to know?
How do you solve?
Yeah, okay, but before you even get there.
Why is it hard?
Well, not necessarily. That's not necessarily important. Why is it hard? That can be part of the explaining the specific problem. Is you may mention why it's hard, but. Yeah. You're asking, or you're not necessarily. I don't think that is the goal of. You don't necessarily. I mean, there have been some things where, in retrospect, I mean, the problem is often you do some piece of work, and in retrospect, your solution seems obvious. Okay, but no one solved it before, so that's perfectly okay. In fact, when that happens, I often make it a point of mentioning as part of the talk that this is a really simple answer, and it's amazing that no one solved this before. People like simple things, so that's not a problem. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so what they want to know is, what did you do? Right? You've convinced them that the problem you're working on, well, you've hopefully convinced them that the problem you're working on is a tangible problem. It's something that prior work didn't address. Now is time to tell them what you did. Okay? So again, many talks don't do this. Many talks sort of motivate the problem, and then they just and then they launch into how did you solve it? Okay, in the details, right? Again, people need to know where you're going. This is the thing that many talks don't do. They sort of just launch into the details without giving this higher level structure about where you're going. And so what I like to do after I finish the motivation section is proudly state the contributions. I have a slide which says contributions, and it lists the contributions of the paper in a concise way. And I sort of walk through that slide. I state it. And say, this is the first system to blah, 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 solve this problem, etc. And the effect that has in the audience is it makes it very clear what you think your research is about. Right? That's a big thing that, as I said, many talks don't say. So once you've stated that, okay, this is really, in some sense, the peak of the talk in terms of like the audience is, if they're going to be following at all, they're the most excited at this point because you've gotten to state this is what we did. And now you want to give them the thing that they're going to take away from the talk because you have their attention. And so this is the point when you transition from the end of the introduction. So this is, if you're following along my timeline here, this was about 6 minutes. I typically budget maybe, about 2 minutes or something for stating the contributions. And then this is the point where we transition to the key ideas, and you should start with a crisp statement of the key ideas. So I often follow contributions with key ideas. And because this is the two slides that people will take away from the talk, what you did, and at a very high level how you did it. And this has two really positive effects. One is it gives the audience a take-home message. That at the moment when they're paying the most attention to the talk, you tell them what was your key idea. And then it gives a focus to the rest of the talk. They know the rest of the talk is going to be about explaining that key idea in more detail. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So, those are the key structuring mechanisms for me for how I get the audience to care. Then the last bit is how do you prevent people from getting lost? And this is generally a hard problem. This is also really a hard problem in writing. Okay, but in writing, of course, even if the reader does get lost, they can always sort of go back to the previous page, or they can read the section again, or whatever. In a talk, they're stuck with you. They have to just follow along the talk in real time. So there's basically two principles that I follow that are the most important principles for how to prevent people from getting lost. And these I call flow and coherence. And these are also essential principles in preventing people getting lost in writing. So I'm going to go into detail. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about flow and a little bit of detail about coherence. So to illustrate flow, I'm going to start by actually showing you what flow means in text. Okay. So the idea of flow is basically that you're trying to get the reader from where they are to where you are. You have to make sure that they follow you along every step of the way. Right? So I'm going to read this text to you, and I want you to think about, does it flow, or is there a point where it stops flowing? Okay. Security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game-playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the first two sentences are good, but the third is...
The third is the problem? Why?
Well, it's not really connected in terms of the text.
Mm-hmm.
It's connecting.
It stops connecting.
Yeah.
And can you say specifically what part stops connecting? Yeah.
This is ambiguous.
This is ambiguous. Oh, where's this? Oh, this here? No, okay, but we're talking about this third sentence here.
So
Yeah.
is the dangling pointer the game playing technique? Where was the
Where was what is that technique exactly? So the problem is this came out of nowhere, right? We suddenly started mentioning a game playing technique, and this came out of nowhere. Didn't have anything to do with what came before. And so this is a very common problem in writing, and also to a large extent in talks. And basically the problem is that the writer in a text or the speaker in a talk knows all this stuff about what they're talking about. They know what the game playing technique is. They just forgot that you didn't know about it, because to them everything is all knowledge, is all existing knowledge, right? This is sometimes called the curse of knowledge. They know all this stuff, and they can't get inside the head of the reader, or in the case of a talk, the audience. So what can you do about this? Well, actually, there's a very simple principle that I follow all the time in my writing that can clearly fix this problem. Called the old-to-do principle. So the old-to-do principle basically says sentences should begin with old information, and they should end with new information. Okay, by beginning with old information, they create a clear link to the previous text. They link to existing knowledge of the reader or of the audience. And by ending with new information, you naturally emphasize. You link to the text that follows, or the talk that follows, but you also place the new info in a position of emphasis, because people tend to naturally place emphasis on the thing they hear at the end of the sentence, or in the case of the talk, at the end of a slide. Okay, so these principles. So just to show you how this would work in this particular paragraph I had before, the problem was that game playing technique was new information, but it appeared at the beginning of the sentence. So it's a very easy problem to diagnose. I see this all the time in students' writing, and it tends to get a lot better once you just are aware of this principle. So here, for example, you could rewrite this by saying, okay, however, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. To make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Have proposed a new design principle called the game-playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. And so this is much easier to follow because the beginning of each sentence is talking about old information, these proofs, such proofs, and the new information in the paragraph comes here at the end of the sentence, which then is referred to immediately in the beginning of the next sentence. Okay. So this is a very important principle to know about, and it's basically the idea in talks is there's two kinds of flow here you have to worry about, or old to new in some sense. One is within a slide. So basically the principle is the script. If you were to write out a script for your talk, or if you record yourself, the script that you're saying should follow this old to new principle. Okay, and then what you're saying will be much more easily understandable by the audience. The other point is between slides, and this is also a very common problem. That a student will finish the slide. Maybe it was perfectly, it had a lot of flow within the slide, but then once they're done with the slide, they just, they finished what they said, and then click. So, and then they start talking about the next slide as if the previous one didn't exist, right? So you can't you can't ignore the previous slide. You have to actually make connections between slides as you're going along, right? And plan something to say during the transition from one slide to the next. Just kidding. So Did it again. See, I told you, it's very hard to... The other major principle for making talks easier to follow, for making talks easier to not get lost in, is coherence. And basically, the idea of coherence is that the audience should know where they are. Okay, they should have an understanding of sort of what is the larger structure of what they're hearing. And there's basically going to be there's two ways this plays out. One is within a slide, and this is the principle that I'm calling here one slide, one point, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. Every slide should have a point. Okay, not multiple different points that are sort of related. One point. So if you look at this slide, take a look at this slide and tell me what you think. It may take you a minute to. There's various problems with this slide, by the way, also on the design side, but that's not actually my main point here, although. So how many points does this slide have? Or can you even identify them? Optimization is one. Okay. That's not quite a point, but... Yeah.
So there are several blocks in this slide, and I'm not sure what a block is trying to do.
Right. So there's actually, if you were to actually break the concepts in this slide into several slides, I think it would actually be perfectly fine. I mean, you want to improve the slide design, that's a separate issue. But there's actually quite a good flow internally within the slide if you just read the text and if there were some more description in what the speaker said. Right. So the point is you're starting with the compiler. Compilers perform optimizations. Fine. Okay. And the problem is that the optimizations that work for sequential programs are not necessarily valid for concurrent programs. Okay. And as a result, compilers do bad things. Okay. Either they're too conservative or they have buggy optimizations. Okay. If I say that to you, that's a perfectly logical flow of ideas. But the problem is when you put it on a slide, well, first of all, that's several ideas. Okay. I went from some general statement about optimizations existing to some problem about compilers having some limitations. Okay. This is a flow from one point to another point, and this is something that actually takes time and takes conceptual energy for the audience member to process. So you need to break this kind of thing into multiple different slides. And if you just break this into multiple different slides, that gives you another benefit, which is the ability to show more more evidence for the individual points. For example, on the slide about backing up this point here with the optimizations being invalid for concurrency, you could give an example that would illustrate that point. So generally, when you have multiple points in one slide, it indicates that somehow you've condensed things too much, and that's what's going to prevent the audience from being able to understand what's going on. Okay, so one slide, one point. Another key issue is higher level structure. Right? I told you that you have this key ideas section that takes like 11 minutes. Well, you need to structure that space. Okay, so you can't just have one long continuous flow of ideas. You have to have more structure. And so I use something I call talklets. So I think about breaking long stretches of talk into smaller pieces that are like around maybe between 2 and 4 minutes each. Okay, so this might be something between like 2 and 5 slides, let's say. And I use those to sort of to think about what are the main points I'm trying to make. And at the beginning of each of those talklets, I say, well, I sort of introduce this is the high level point of this talklet, and then I develop it, and then at the end I sort of sum up what we learned from that talklet and how it connects to or how it motivates the next talklet. Okay, and you may feel like it's hard to get these talklets into your talk because you don't have enough time. Well, then you have to simplify your story. Right? There's no way around it. People will not be able to understand some continuous thread of thought over many slides without telling them where they are in the talk, telling them about the high-level structure, and building that into your talk. And also, by the way, again, as transitions between slides, the transitions between talklets are a great point to sort of remind the audience member where they are. So, any questions about that so far? Okay, so to conclude, I'm going to mention just a few words about slide design. So this slide design doesn't quite fit into the sort of general narrative I've told you about why is a talk different from a, well, actually, it is relevant to why a talk is different from a paper, so now that I think about it. In a paper, the beauty of your, or the look of your paper is not so important, but in a talk, it really does matter. And to illustrate this, so a general comment about slide design, you don't have to be a great artist, okay? I'm not, I don't have, I don't have a great sense of style. I'm not very gifted visually, etc. But I think that I have some basic tools that that I know about to avoid making sort of design errors. And to illustrate this, before I tell you what my basic principles are, I'm going to show you two sets of slides. I want you to look at them and just say, what do you think the differences are? Okay? I'll show one briefly, and then I'll show the other, and then give me your comments. That's the first one. And don't read it. Don't try to read this. Okay. It's not clearly. I didn't intend for you to read that. That's one. That's another. Any thoughts? Yeah.
The first one
Good.
The first one has a lot more text.
Yes.
You're not sure what you're supposed to pay attention to.
Yes, there's a lot of text. It's not clear what you're supposed to look. Well, yeah, I mean, presumably what you're supposed to look at is all the text. Yeah, there's a lot of text. Yeah.
Are they even slideshows about the same thing?
Say again. Are there even?
Are they slides about the same thing?
Are these slides? Oh, no, they're not about the same thing. I'm just asking you to look at the look of the text. That's the point. It doesn't matter if they're about the same thing.
But I mean, it could be that this first slide is actually a really good slide, and the thing that's
No. No, it can't be. That's the point. That's why it doesn't matter what these talks are about. So, I mean, if you, it doesn't matter. They shouldn't look like, this is my point. They shouldn't look like this. It's one thing, by the way, I should also make it clear. What I'm talking about here is, as I hope I made clear earlier, a conference talk, okay? Obviously, if you're teaching a lecture in a class where you want people to be able to use the slides like lecture notes, etc., and you're giving lots of definitions and whatever formal details, that's a different story. But here we're talking about conference talk. It should not look like that. Yeah. Yeah.
the slide is always the same, so there's no way to actually get my attention.
The style is always the same. Exactly. The look, there's no variation in the look of the slides. In fact, if you did look at the text here, you would see that there's actually, this is not, by the way, the same slide 3 times or something with slide. This is different point. This is like before something and after something, before something else and after something else, before something else and after something else. This is, so you might not even, if you're just like slightly zoning out, you might have not even noticed that you slipped from one slide to the next. And then by that point, you're like completely lost, okay? Whereas here, the slides just look different, okay? There's some of them have big pictures, some of them have more text, some of them even have text used as a picture, okay? This is supposed to be like a paper. This is supposed to be a scary looking paper over there. That's what they're saying, right? So there's like there's a mixture of different things, and so you're not lulled to sleep, okay? So these are basically the 2 points. One is to sort of avoid this kind of PowerPointitis, right? Which is where you just put a lot of text, you dump all the stuff you have to explain on the slide, so that because a lot of people worry, like, well, if someone didn't come to my talk and they wanted to understand it afterwards, they want to look at the slides and get all the information. Forget about it. Don't worry about people who didn't come to your talk, okay? Those people can read your paper. The point of the talk is to communicate to the people who are there, okay? So don't dump a lot of text on your slide. Dump as much text as you need, but no more. And then vary the look of the slides. Some text-only slides, like this one, for example, are perfectly fine. Okay, this came after a couple slides that were completely visual. That's fine to have that as a counterbalance. But if you have too many slides like this in a row, and again, in a conference talk, then the audience will fall asleep. Okay, so with that, I thank you for your attention, and if you have any other questions, I'll take them now. Thanks. Yeah.
So there's a common discussion on outline slides or not. And
An outline slides, yeah. Right.
And so what is your opinion on
I generally, some people really hate outline slides. So like John Hughes in his talk on giving talks, he makes a big point of that. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I also don't think it's usually necessary. So I probably don't have outline slides too much. And maybe it depends on if you want to give some high-level structure, for example, to the key ideas section. Maybe you state your key ideas in that key ideas slide, the takeaway slide, and then maybe that gives you a natural way of saying, well, okay, now I can tell you about what's the structure of the rest of the talk. And then you have a very brief outline, maybe with like 2 or 3 bullets in it. Very brief things to say, like, I'm going to explain this key idea, I'm first going to do this, then this, then this, and then move on. That can be fine. But what's problem is, the classic bad thing is when someone starts off the talk, and people do this less and less now, but it used to be the case that you'd go to many talks where the first slide is outline, okay? And that's the worst, okay? Then then the audience is asleep already because, okay, they have no idea what the talk is about, but they're already seeing all the low-level details of how it's going to be structured. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
You also didn't say anything about a summary at the end or something like key ideas.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's okay to have a lot of people do have a conclusion slide. I typically find, at least for talks that are like only 20 minutes long, I'm running out of time, and it's more important. I think basically, if someone didn't understand the key idea by that point, they probably missed the talk. Okay, I mean, they're not gonna. It's not like by stating it at the very end they're gonna suddenly understand everything. It's just too late. So it's also for the same reason that I don't usually have conclusions in papers. I also feel like just repeating the same thing over and over again. So I don't think it's necessary, but sometimes it's nice to have, especially if you have some interesting comment that is worth putting on at the end that talks about future work. Yeah.
So do you always end your slides with "that's all" or "thank you"?
Yeah, I often just leave it on what else is in the paper, or I say thank you. Yeah. Or put up a future work slide or something. I leave it on the last slide basically. But yeah, thank you is always fine. Yeah.
Do you think it helps to script the talk, or?
That's a very good question. So I think it does help to script parts of a talk, and I often do script parts of a talk if it's it depends on how important the talk is. So some parts of a talk are often very hard to get right. You try to practice them over and over again. You can't get the wording right. It's a tricky segment of the talk. Yeah, I often write down a script. I try it out. I practice it, and then maybe I memorize it, or maybe I practice it enough that I don't. Slight variations are not a big deal. I think it's fine to script parts of a talk. I think if you what you shouldn't do, unless you have some English language issue that prevents you from that it gives you some other problems, is to script the whole talk. I mean, I have had some. I have advised some students who had an English language, or it was very challenging for them to give the talk if they couldn't read the script. Right? They just that can work, but it's very risky because what if your computer breaks down, or what if you have to suddenly use someone else's laptop and their keynote settings are messed up or something like that. It's just then you're toast. So I mean, I've done that, or not I've done that, but I've had students who do that. I was just it's too dangerous. But in general, yeah, it's fine to do it in small parts. Yeah.
How often do you practice the talk?
Well, it depends on. So for a new talk, basically it's proportional to the size of the audience. So if it's or the importance of the talk. Okay, so like when I had to give a talk for my tenure committee, or when I was going up for tenure. Okay, that one I practiced. It was only like 7 people in the room or something like that, but that was practice. But yeah, generally for like a big conference, yeah, I'll practice quite a lot. I mean, now I don't give as many talks for conferences. We're usually students giving the talks, and I know they practice quite a lot as well. I mean, it can take weeks to prepare a talk.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I guess the kind of talk we are all most familiar with are lectures.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most important difference between them?
Well, it's a lot. I mean, there's a lot less writing on the lecture. I mean, in a lecture, first of all, you're trying to be interactive, and that totally changes the nature of the talk. Right? You're thinking about how to actually engage the audience in an interactive discussion. Well, or you should be. Not everyone is. Whereas a talk at a conference is not interactive. And so you have to basically guess the problem. This means you have to think about the problems that the audience is going to have understanding your talk beforehand. This is what practice talks are for. Okay, you should give as many practice talks as you can. Some people overdo it, right? When you give a practice talk, you get feedback. Don't give a talk the next day. Okay, it takes time to actually integrate the feedback, practice the talk enough for the next talk to be worth it. But doing multiple practice talks is great if you can do it. Sorry, I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but for me, that's the main difference, is the interactiveness. And there's just a lot more writing on the line for a conference talk. You're talking to hundreds of people. Well, actually, okay, for a lecture, depending on where you are, you could be also talking to hundreds of people. Yeah, it's just yeah.
All right, let's thank Derek.
Thank you.